K. And Brian Tomasik was actually one of the panelists in a previous conversation we had alongside David Pearce, Mike Johnson, and Andreas Gomelson. I always get his name wrong, but anyway. So yeah, that was a very interesting panel on reducing suffering. But now we have Brian Tomasik here today, and we're going to be discussing again reducing suffering. It's a pretty important topic. So Brian has a degree in, at university did statistics and computer science, and has written quite extensively on philosophy and reducing suffering, and also has is involved in the Foundational Research Institute with some other guys in Switzerland, and actually I forgot to mention used to be like an employee of Microsoft. So yeah, would you welcome Brian? Would you like to fill in the gaps there about your what you're doing at the Foundational Research Institute?
Sure, and thanks for having me. So
My pleasure.
the Foundational Research Institute, or FRI, is an organization that I co-founded in 2013 with some people in Switzerland who are also interested in prioritizing the most effective ways to reduce suffering in the far future. And so that's FRI's main purpose, but on a concrete level, we tend to focus on some topics that seem most important to us, which include artificial intelligence trajectories, suffering-focused ethical views, and wild animal suffering, and some other topics as well. So the vision is to be a place where people who consider suffering extremely important can contribute ideas about where humanity should best change its direction to reduce prospects of suffering in the far future.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Sounds like a very important research initiative there. So what are some, what are these guys focusing on? What sort of practical problems are they trying to solve today? Yeah, and I mean, what sort of research do they advocate? What sort of research are they actually involved in?
Well, so there are a few different topic areas. I'll start with artificial intelligence, which is one of the focus areas. And so our perspective here is we share a lot of the background that people like Nick Bostrom or the Machine Intelligence Research Institute have described, and we leverage a lot of their ideas. But what we want to do is add to the discussion considerations about suffering in the far future, not just, say, human extinction. So if you think about the discussion of AI in the news especially, it's usually focused on robots will kill us all or something. And then MIRI or FHI, Future of Humanity Institute, also focus on questions like, will we lose a lot of the value of the future? For example, Eliezer Yudkowsky talks about fun theory and the importance of having complex novel challenges rather than repetitive, boring computations or something. So,
and actually, that's a topic that I'm very interested in as well.
Yeah.
So, look, sorry to butt in there, but I was just wondering why there hasn't yet been like a focus on creating some form of novelty utilitarianism. I've put the word out there. I did a search a while ago, and there was absolutely nothing on the internet, at least according to Google, on that topic area. So I've been trying to sort of motivate and prod people to sort of take that up. But yeah, I was going to bring this particular topic up too. Yeah, it's funny. There's all sorts of convergences within our different sort of groups across the world on these ideas. I find it's interesting. So yeah, go on, Brian.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of focus either on robots killing humans or failure to achieve the best that humanity could get from a galactic future. But there's less focus in these other organizations on the risks of suffering from artificial intelligence. And so FRI is trying to fill that gap and say, if you're very focused on reducing suffering, what should you think about artificial intelligence risks? And then we can get a bit of a different perspective and maybe enhance the current discussion. So we have some thoughts about ways in which AI, both human-controlled and uncontrolled, could produce lots of suffering in the far future. So I could either get into that now, or we could save it for a later question.
Okay. Well, first of all, yeah, let's talk about what motivated you to get interested in like reducing suffering in the first place. I mean, let's talk about you a little bit, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So, what got you interested in actually reducing suffering in the first place? What motivates you? I mean, you seem to be very passionate about this. What got you first interested in this? In fact, yeah.
Well, I first became interested in altruism in the year 2000 after I heard a speech by Ralph Nader, who was the Green Party presidential candidate for president in the US. And he made the point that there's a lot of injustice and suffering in the world, and people in wealthy nations have a large degree of control and ability to change that suffering. And so that was inspiring, and I became interested in pretty conventional political issues for a few years. And then in 2005, I discovered Peter Singer's writings and discovered that there was a philosophy called utilitarianism that provided a framework that I very much agreed with as far as how to prioritize what actions are most important and how to evaluate actions. And so then I also, through Peter Singer, discovered the importance of animal suffering, and that reoriented my worldviews because there are so many animals relative to humans on the planet. So those factors made me interested in utilitarianism in general, and over time I began to feel that extreme suffering was more morally important than pleasure, even intense pleasure. And there were a few different motivations for this. One of them was the writings of David Pearce. His Hedonistic Imperative in 2006 helped to refine my views about this. I also met some other friends who maintained a similar position. And I think it's a fairly widespread intuition that, for example, the suffering of torture maybe can't be outweighed by more trivial good things. And at least people seem to have that intuition in the interpersonal case. That is, the torture of one person can't be justified by the happiness of others. It's more debatable whether it applies in the intrapersonal case as well.
There's an interesting novel, an interesting short story by Ursula Guin called "Those Who Walk Away from Omelas." And it talks about like this one child suffering being the basis of a happy civilization. Yeah, it's very interesting, in fact.
Yeah.
So you're not willing to make any trade-off at all about suffering versus like bliss. So would you classify yourself as a negative utilitarian?
Yeah, now I am. In the past, I had varying views on this. So until 2006, I was actually a regular non-negative utilitarian. And I thought it was important to spread happiness. And actually, I first encountered Le Guin's short story in 2006, and I thought I disagreed with it because I was a regular utilitarian and thought the happiness could outweigh the suffering. But over time, I've grown to think that at least intense suffering is just much more important. And so in practice, it doesn't, as long as you think intense suffering is very weighty compared to intense pleasure, say that the pain of being tortured or burned alive is, say, 1 billion times worse than the best pleasures or something, then you're going to adopt basically the same practical conclusions as a pure negative utilitarian, because the ratios of pleasure and pain, both now and even in the far future, at least in expectation, will not be billions of times different. So in practice, I'm probably a negative utilitarian, but regardless of whether I'm a negative utilitarian in a strict sense or whether I value pain 1 billion to 1 versus pleasure, it amounts to the same practical conclusions.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, it seems as though there's you know, a lot of repugnant conclusions to go around amongst various philosophical types, and like one of them about the whole against negative utilitarianism is that somebody would be willing to switch off the universe for the sake of a pinprick happening somewhere, or an expected possible pinprick, and thus, you know, reducing potential value to zero because of a little bit of disvalue. Now, yeah, so I mean, like, it seems as though there's quite a bit of, you know, it seems as though that it does require some balance there. We haven't even gotten into like a personal choice yet about like what kind of balance somebody is individually willing to have in order to like you know, move forward, and how much suffering are you willing to go through in order to experience more pleasure in the future, and how much should it be ethically permissible to allow for and even impose, how much suffering should be allowed to be imposed in order to achieve greater pleasure in the future. I mean, we do tests on animals all the time in science, and because of that, we have seen some like you know, marked improvements in the way that we understand our biology and the biology of our animals as well, which may in turn hasten the elimination or the reduction of the biology of suffering in the future. But remember, we're making these animals suffer today so that species or sentiences in the future can, well, at least tentatively can be more happy and be have less unhappy lives in brief, you know.
Yeah, so as far as animal testing, you can, by the way, I'm getting an echo. I'm not sure where that's from, but as far as animal testing, you can make some argument on pure negative utilitarian grounds if it reduces more suffering in the future. But I agree there also needs to be some balance. So I tend to think that my values are, say, 90% negative utilitarian and 10% giving weight to other things that people care about, which could be happiness or equality, or if paperclip maximizers existed, I would care some about paperclips, things like that. So that helps to constrain the rough edges of the thought experiments. As far as the pinprick, also, you could make an argument purely on instrumental grounds. For example, it's better to be cooperative and sacrifice a little bit of what you care about in return for making other agents happy. And it would be like, since you can increase the value of other agents so much by not eliminating the world just for the pinprick, it's better to do that than take a very hard line there. And then also, I also tend to think that extreme suffering is much worse than mild suffering. So there's debate about whether to hold what's called a threshold negative utilitarian view, that is, thinking that there's some threshold below which suffering is lexically worse, or essentially infinitely worse than suffering less bad than the threshold. If you adopt that kind of view, then you also get strange thought experiments when you compare sufferings just below the threshold and sufferings just above the threshold. But at least I think it's the negative utilitarian view would be less absurd if it were like the Omelas case, where you've got one person being tortured in return for the world existing.
Right. Yes. So okay. In order to determine what counts as a threshold and where these thresholds should lie, rather than just, you know, throwing a stick and seeing where it lands in the sand, how do we go about that? I mean, like, are you an ethical realist or a moral realist, in a sense that you can actually observe the universe to help inform where these thresholds lie? Or do you think that it's particularly, it's essentially relativistic to yeah, are you a moral relativist? And in that case, who do you barrack for? Which moral relativism are you supporting, and why?
I'm a moral relativist, although that should be used in the sense of a non-realist. So I think there may also be realist relativists, but I think ethics is very likely not part of the ontology of the universe, and therefore it's something that we construct, and it's relative to our own values and desires. So as far as determining thresholds, I also think that that's essentially relative. So even if you think about happiness and suffering, the classical utilitarian thinks that these, or at least the naive classical utilitarian picture, is that happiness and suffering are some sort of quantities that have specific numbers that attach to physical processes. But if you think about what happiness and suffering are at bottom, they're collections of processes of underlying neurons, or even at a deeper level, atoms moving around and things like that. So ultimately, happiness and suffering are constructions and labels that we apply to the high-level system of complex underlying processing. And how we apply those labels is going to be up to us. It's not as though there's an extra part of the ontology of the universe where a happiness property exists and has some absolute number. So even happiness and suffering, what the classical utilitarian cares about, are arbitrary in some sense. And so in that sense, there's no unique classical utilitarianism. There's an infinite family of classical utilitarianisms depending on what values you assign to what physical states. So, but we can still make some progress about assigning values based on various criteria, like if you ask the agent, if the agent undergoes a suffering experience and a happy experience, and then reports on what kind of trade-off it would make. Although there are some problems with that approach, because the agent may have different preferences depending on what stage of the process it's in. For example, if you torture somebody bad enough, that person will probably say anything to make it stop, even rejecting infinite future pleasure, perhaps, if the torture is bad enough. Whereas then afterwards, if you, once the torture is done and the person is enjoying bliss, the person might say it was worth it after all. Sort of a rosy retrospection, and I'm glad I did that because the reward is worth it. Now it's in the past. So it's tricky to come up with a unique set of trade-offs here, even for relative to a single agent's preferences. You could also look at—
Certainly is.
Yeah, you could also look at maybe objective measures, like the degree of, if you had some sort of handle on what sort of algorithms were operating in the agent's brain, you could look at the degree of update of neural weights, like aversive weights versus positive weights towards certain stimuli. But those again are going to be crude, and they may not map perfectly onto what the agent would say it feels about the situation.
Right. So there's a whole like a map and territory thing going there. So I don't know. My intuition is that I don't think you have to be like an essentialist to believe and believe our conceptions of morality are actual properties of the universe outside of our pattern recognition systems. But on the other hand, from a weak, like that may be a strong, like a moral relativist perspective, maybe. But on the other hand, a weak and more, I guess, practically informed perspective would be that we need to discover what counts as valuable in the universe, and what sorts of patterns are more amenable to value and more amenable to reducing suffering and increasing pleasure, regardless of the configuration or across all configurations of possible conscious states, if that's relevant. And arguably it's not. If you take David Pearce's point of view, I think he's a Strawsonian physicalist in the sense that there's an experience property at a very basic level of physics and it's not some sort of like emergent property that supervenes on certain patterns that are like quote unquote conscious. So in order to like really understand what it means to do the right thing, I think we'd both be on the side of getting more informed about how physics works and how that relates to our experience and other possible conscious experience, and what counts as suffering. And like, I wouldn't like to state that a particular idealism that we should cling on to for the rest of eternity about what counts as suffering and what doesn't. So an empirically informed view, as well as one that is based in the logic that we can sort of compute, then yeah, I think that's a good way forward. I'm just wondering where you sit there. Yeah, that's a long question. Okay.
Yeah. So
shall I simplify that? Okay. To what extent are you interested in discovering what's valuable? We're not just talking about fun theory, Maggie Bowden or Eliezer Yudkowsky's versions or whatnot. We're talking about like value, not just fun, but what counts as value and disvalue, and what configurations of future civilizations are more amenable to continue this discovery process if it can't be just Kantianly logically determined, and we can all, you're not a Kantian, are you? Do you believe, like, do you have sympathy for deontology?
I have sympathy only for instrumental reasons, essentially, and decision theoretic reasons. So if you think about certain decision theory problems, a Kantian can win, whereas an act utilitarian will lose on those problems, like honesty, commitments, and things like that. And in human societies, Kantianism can work pretty well, as also because that's how humans think, and laws work well when they have these kind of rule-based structures. But in terms of intrinsic value, I side more with utilitarians.
Right. Yeah.
So then, as far as the value, thinking about what has value. So I agree that's an important topic, although I'm little bit less. I put a little bit less priority on it than, say, Mike Johnson, whom we talked with over the summer, because I think, for one thing, there are already a lot of people thinking about the topic in various ways. Like, there are philosophers of mind, neuroscientists thinking about neural correlates of consciousness, AI scientists also thinking about consciousness questions, and a lot of other people putting thought into the matter. So I think marginal contributions can make a difference, but there's already a lot of work being done. And diversity is probably important because we tend to have a meta value of valuing having our positions challenged and looking at things in new ways. And so having lots of people from lots of perspectives think about these questions can enhance the richness of the resulting reflective equilibrium if we come to one. So another point which you sort of hinted at is that I think what's more important now is often questions of trajectory rather than figuring out ethics per se. Nick Bostrom makes a similar point in his Superintelligence book, where he suggests that philosophers should focus the most on questions like getting AI correct or pushing it in better directions, and thinking about how to move society into a more cooperative and stable future. And specific details of metaphysics or maybe ethics or things like that can in principle wait longer, because once we have more resources and once we have AI, those questions will be easier to think about. That's not an absolute statement, because it's important to think about lots of topics to make sure you're not missing something big. Like, maybe if we don't design an AI in the right way, it would not think about ethics the way we want it to, and then we would miss out on things that we would have cared about. And there are big unknowns with areas like anthropic reasoning or decision theory or other philosophical issues that could make a big difference to AI. So I think you do need a lot of inputs from a lot of fields to get the questions right. But at a high level, on the margin, I would tend to push more on AI trajectories and thinking about future scenarios. And the exact details of the ethics can wait, although it is also good to get some broad stroke visions of what we think we might want to end up with. As far as what kind of designs would give better results in the future, I'm sympathetic to views like coherent extrapolated volition that would allow for essentially an extended and more rigorous version of a philosophy discussion or democratic debates, or basically allowing people to exchange with each other and have new ideas and new experiences. Unfortunately, I think a pure coherent extrapolated volition is unlikely to happen, because if you think about the way power structures control society now, I don't think that's going to go away. I don't think we're going to have a future in which we have pure egalitarianism among all participants in some sort of philosophical discussion. More likely, power politics and wealth and other differences in resources will strongly shape whatever AI future we end up with. But at least CEV can be a useful ideal and something to push more towards.
Yeah, I do like the idea of a coherent extrapolated volition or some form of aggregate across different sorts of volitions out there. Though it does require there being like a very efficient and intelligent algorithm to help extrapolate all these volitions. The very process of humans trying to aggregate volition in a non-biased way seems very difficult. Yeah, because of how, our psychology, maybe through nurture and through education, we can sort of train ourselves to be non-biased in our distribution of what counts as relevant volition there. Yeah, so it's interesting. And yeah, I mean, like for viewers who are not initiated with the whole idea of AI, maybe we should just briefly touch on that, the whole idea of an intelligence explosion and why that's important. And you mentioned trajectories before, and I'm pretty sure you're not just talking about when AI will come about, but yeah, it'd be interesting to know what your confidence intervals are, what the likelihoods across time that you believe strong AI or an intelligence explosion to be possible.
Yeah, so it's somewhat fuzzy because my default picture of AI is not a single point where it surpasses humans. Like if you think about, I mean,
so
AI
you're not talking about like some form of like a hard takeoff firm scenario here. You don't think that that's likely?
My inside view relative to my own thoughts on the question place a low probability on hard takeoff, maybe 5 or 10%, just based on my own imagination. Giving weight to other people's views, given that there's peer disagreement and a lot of smart people place higher probability on a hard takeoff, I might up that to say 25% or something. But yeah, at least my default scenario would be a more gradual process, similar to what we've seen already. If you think about when computers surpass humans, many decades ago, they surpassed humans in arithmetic or basic data storage. In recent years, they've surpassed humans in certain gameplay, like chess and Watson with Jeopardy and things like that. And then over time, they'll take over more and more human skills. So it's not as though there will be a single point where something with the same level as humans surpasses humans in all fields. I think that's less likely than something with just different skills taking more and more niches in the human economy. So part of the motivation for this is that it seems like human society is very complicated, and it's hard to do everything better all at once. So if you think about the economy, it's already essentially a recursively self-improving superintelligence, in that when people produce something of value in one domain, it speeds up progress in all the other domains. And so we do see an intelligence explosion in the economy of sorts. We see exponential growth, but it's a very slow exponential growth relative to Froome scenarios. So we might see something similar in the case of AI, or like Moore's law. We've got exponential growth, but it's at least slow enough to
well, certainly it certainly might. Yeah, that's right. At the moment, it certainly looks like if we're going to take like a geological perspective, it certainly looks like a Froome scenario from that point of view. And it would have been it would have been interesting to be around for that long to actually experience. We could be going through the singularity from right now from a geological perspective view, or even like an evolutionary timelines perspective. And evolution doesn't really know what's hit it yet. Really, I think it hasn't really cottoned on to the idea that it may have created its own usurpers. Right? It sort of somehow stumbled upon rationality. That is universal enough to be able to be used outside of the domains of increasing the ability to spread one's genes in the ancestral environment. So it's very interesting. I like to think about it.
But given that, I was just going to give some AI timeline thoughts. So I mean, given the caveats about it's difficult to precisely define a date or a point in time where AI surpasses humans, I tend to put things, say, 100 years off, plus or minus wide error margins. I'd be very surprised if it was earlier than 30 or 40 years. And maybe, assuming human technology continues without major disruption, I would be surprised if it took longer than several hundred years. But
remember, disruption can work both ways. It can actually, as Popper said, cannot know what we'll discover tomorrow, and there may be like some algorithmic discoveries, or just even putting to pieces in the right way, such that intelligence, like the general intelligence problem may be solved, and that applied to its own source code could be not that far off. But it's hard to say that it'll happen in the next 10 years, but it might, right? However, like low your probability.
maybe 1% chance or less. But I guess my intuition is just that software is very complicated, and like humans have not found. There's a famous article about no silver bullets in software engineering, and humans have not found a single clean way to do things very well. We have powerful tools like compilers or other kinds of source code analysis, and other things that make us very efficient. But historically, they've come in pretty gradual steps, such that the transitions have not been overwhelming at any given point in time.
So you assign a very low probability, perhaps 1% in the next 10 years. How about in 10 to 20, like, let's say, okay, so it's 2015 now. From 2025 to 2035, what would that be? Just to get more specific.
Maybe 2 or 3%.
And we're not committing.
Yeah.
And then 2035 to 45 or 55, let's say, give it another 20 years, because we can't be here forever, right? Okay.
Yeah, maybe 10%.
Okay.
15% maybe.
15%, and then like let's say 2055 to the end of the century. 2100.
So this is within that range, not the ones before that. I'd say maybe 50%.
Yep. Okay, that's interesting. You aware of Stuart Armstrong's analysis of various experts' opinions on this? Did you read the? Yeah. It seems as though you're a little bit more yeah, a bit
I think
more
it'll take
skeptical.
longer.
It'll happen.
And
Yeah, it happen in shorter timescales than a lot of well, at least the aggregate of the experts that were like asked in that particular survey. Do you think there
yeah,
needs
so
to be
that
another
is,
survey? Was it done wrong, or could it be done better?
well, it still might be biased by people who go into AI, and probably if you asked the general public or even non-AI scientists, they put much farther timelines, I would guess. I haven't done that survey myself, but yeah, I'm worried about, or at least not not very worried in an emotional sense, but like I should take heed of the fact that I'm diverging from the median estimate of the experts.
Yeah,
So
that's interesting. Yeah,
I give some updates in their direction on those grounds.
Mm-hmm. And I got a bit sort of sidetracked before, and we didn't actually discuss what this intelligence explosion really was. And I'm sorry, viewers, for that. But I'm sure if you look it up on the internet, you'll be able to find it. But in basis, it's I think I.J. Good said, let an ultra-intelligent machine be defined as a machine that can fast pass all the intellectual activities of any man, however clever. And he goes into like if you can apply these intelligence to its own algorithms or its own optimization of intelligence, then the extra intelligence gained in optimizing itself would be able to be fed into the next cycle of processes. Labyrinths repeat, you may end up with an intelligence that is very, very smart. And whether this will be like a FOOM, hard takeoff, quick scenario, whether it'll be a longer trend or like a surge somewhere in between, is debatable, but I think it's important to say that regardless of your particular bias and what the timelines are, or whether it's a firm scenario, whether it's a hard take, whether it's a slower surge or like a even slower trend over time, the expected utility of like a hugely smart artificial intelligence in the future is rather large, since a lot of the problems that we're tackling with today could benefit from more intelligence applied to them. And I assume that will be in the future as well, and continue as problems get more difficult as time goes on. Or the lower fruit gets lower hanging fruit gets consumed, and the more difficult problems are the ones we need to solve.
Yeah,
So,
and consistent with my soft takeoff bias, I would tend to see the problems getting solved slowly in pieces, and we already see that already. A new startup solves a new problem or a new technology in other fields like biotech or whatever solve small problems incrementally. So that's consistent with a view of eventual superhuman intelligence, but coming in pieces.
So, in what ways would you say the way that we should plan and counter and let's say like a non-beneficial in artificial intelligence in the future, how would they differ from one which we could experience a hard takeoff, and one in which it'll be a slow, gradual trend? Or do a graduated series of spikes, but small spikes?
It's worth pointing out that I think humans can lose control of the future in both scenarios. And so in the soft takeoff case, you can have scenarios like Robin Hanson's emulations, where you have a society that becomes more and more focused on productivity, in the sense that the most productive members vastly dominate the others in wealth and capability. And so there's kind of a selection pressure for being more and more productive and stripping away other things that people value, like art or leisure or relationships, and just focusing on maximum production. So Nick Bostrom discusses this in his paper, The Future of Human Evolution. So it relates to what you were saying before about evolution vanishing. In a scenario, if evolution sticks around, then it seems likely, or at least reasonably likely, that we would have some sort of value drift due to evolution surpassing what humans currently are interested in. In some sense, Robin Hanson calls the present dream time, which is sort of the view that we're currently out of Malthusian pressures, and we have a lot of resources and leisure to think about philosophy, and it's sort of a temporary phase in the future if evolution continues, because eventually the Malthusian pressures will come back and we'll have more strong selection. But so it's not at all clear that the way things are now or the values that humans have would survive even with a slow takeoff. And so
yeah, it seems as though that scenario seems to be like a favoring either biological mind uploads or agents that can think faster in in a less biased way, untethered to some of the clues that natural selection have sort of created in our brains.
Yeah, I guess it's not clear what you would favor in that scenario, but it's certainly possible that uploads would be better than artificial agents insofar as they would be more human-like, and so better able to match artificial agents in speed. Although I think uploads will be many decades away in terms of being able to be run on non-trivial resources. But there are certainly other scenarios where, for example, if you humans also have problems, and you can also get evil behavior from humans that you might not get from more of an indifferent machine. And so there are lots of considerations on both sides when thinking about whether you favor uploads first or de novo AI first.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So it's interesting, like Nick Bostrom also discussed the idea of mindcrime. And since we're talking about ethics here, and it's interesting to think that we could also be creating mindcrime covers just like if an AI conducts thought experiments with real conscious creatures in its thought experiments and causes them to suffer, then it's considered, like we'd assume that you agree that would be bad in general, like all things being equal. Though, would you be happy for that to happen if it sort of resulted or consequently resulted in there being more happiness in the future? So if it was the most efficient means to get there.
Yeah. This is one of the main scenarios that FRI thinks about as far as how both controlled and uncontrolled AI could produce lots of suffering in the future. So it seems a convergent objective that many AIs would want to run simulations to learn about the universe, maybe to study evolution on other planets, to learn whether there are aliens in its neighborhood, maybe to study the past or study the space of minds in general. And so you could end up with a significant number of simulations. And then it becomes an important question how much that future AI would care about what it's doing. So probably by default, most uncontrolled AIs would not care at all, except maybe for instrumental reasons if they were trading with others about the simulations that they run. So that could be one reason why even a negative utilitarian could be worried about, say, a paperclip maximizer taking over. With humans, it's more unclear, and it depends a lot on how humane civilization becomes and whether human values retain control or whether they mutate into some other form by the time goals become more stable in an AI civilization. So, yeah, but so as far as the trade-offs, it does seem as though you would probably need some number of simulations in the same way as we maybe need some number of experiments on animals to produce the most essential things, like to cure AIDS or whatever. Like it's probably necessary to have some simulations to prevent greater suffering elsewhere, or at least to protect yourself from being taken over or something. But there's probably a lot of leeway in how many such simulations are run. and maybe you can edit out the worst parts without reducing fidelity of the result very much. Like if you're simulating evolution, once a prey animal is caught by a predator, you could shut off its brain rather than letting it to continue suffer while dying, because that won't make a difference to the evolutionary dynamics. So there are probably a lot of ways you can vastly improve the humaneness of simulations. So I think it's important for people concerned with suffering to push in those directions and point out the ways we can make the future much less bad, even if we do produce massive amounts of computing power, and even if we do produce simulations that will involve some suffering.
Yeah, so it seems interesting. I mean, there's a couple of ways we can take this discussion. But first of all, I'd just like to get down to fundamentals. Most utilitarian frameworks focus on reducing one parameter, like suffering, or increasing one parameter, like hedonism, or maybe a combination between these two parameters. And in as much as they're discoverable by observing the universe and rationalizing about what we observe, or if they're completely just arbitrary. Yeah, I guess we could be in for a really difficult time ahead if our values do mutate and drift in a direction where that doesn't really value the experience of sentient life forms, or sentience in general. Because I don't think we count like artificial agents as life forms yet, because they don't share the properties that most scientists define. Okay, so forget about like taxonomy of what life actually means today, what it might mean tomorrow. So the question is, if you believe that there will be value drift and value mutation, how do we control the direction in a beneficial way when there may not be anything in the universe to inform us in what direction you take? For instance, like a position that a soft moral realist may take.
Well, so about value drift, I'm not sure there will be substantial value drift. I think that depends on the trajectory. So there's always some value drift in society, often good value drift, like people being more supportive of gay marriage than 20 years ago. So there are many good forms of value drift as well. But I think when we come to having digital agents have more and more power in the future, it could be that value drift declines, and that depends on whether humanity becomes very coordinated in the future. So Nick Bostrom has a concept of a singleton, which he calls the highest level of decision-making authority. That could be a single AI, it could be a world government that has sufficient power over individual countries. It could be, in the bad cases, a dictatorship, a world dictatorship or something. So those kinds of scenarios where you've got a singleton would at least reduce value drift, because you have more, you can basically suppress evolution. Essentially, singleton is the opposite of evolution in some sense. Singleton allows you to control competition and achieve positive sum outcomes rather than defection on prisoners' dilemmas. And so if we have that kind of outcome, then in value drift could slow down, and in the long run it could even stop permanently if we have a civilization with a superintelligence that figures out goal preservation. As Steve Omohundro says, goal preservation is a basic AI drive. Once you've got a set of goals, you want to preserve them as well as you can. And with artificial digital agents, it's easier to do goal preservation because you can create worker robots or worker subroutines that don't rebel against you. One of the reasons there hasn't been a permanent monarchy or ruler in human history is that the underlings always want to rebel if they can, because in the ancestral environment, it was beneficial to rebel against a tyrannical alpha male. And so,
at least in some scenarios, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So
If you can.
there was value in cooperation and value in like rebellion.
Right, right, and like you, the underlings don't want to be underlings, but they might be only if they're forced to be. So if they have an opportunity to rebel, they will. Whereas with a robot, in principle, it will go on serving you without wanting to rebel because it hasn't been programmed to want to do that. So with artificial agents, it becomes more plausible that you could have a permanent control over outcomes, especially if you have error correcting programs or other ways to prevent even mutations at all from happening. And so from that perspective, it could be that once intelligence becomes strong enough and centralized enough, goals won't drift anymore, unless we want them to, such as by implementing CEV or something. So from that perspective, it could make a big difference what humanity's values are in the next century and how exactly we shape AI going forward, because at some point it could be that the value drift stops. And so the values that we create over the next century or two could potentially be the final values of Earth originating intelligence.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if I see there's a possibility, at least, that AI may actually go on some sort of axiological quest to discover what counts as most valuable across time, and what counts as the most disvaluable across time. And there I see the role for novelty. But let's get into that later. So the idea that if we do sev our way to paradise, we may still be catching ourselves in, if value drift is suppressed, catch ourselves in some local maximum based on what we know about what's valuable today or in the near future, or if we're smarter, stronger, smarter, wiser, up to a certain point, then yeah, we could end up being stuck in a narrow maximum bandwidth, and that could be boring in the sense that we spend all our resources maintaining, our lotus thrones with, only 2 billion hedonic set points above zero, whereas if we maintain some form of like a willingness to drift value based on what we discover from mining novelty, then we could achieve, orders of magnitude of, millions and millions of hedonic set points above hedonic zero. Yeah, so it's interesting. But also I think there's a motivation that's at least philosophically or logically reasonable for an AI, and that is not just for an AI to discover value that is more able to achieve greater value in the future. The sort of configurations of civilizations or patterns of existence that are amenable to updating, as well as amenable to pleasure or whatever you're valuing at the time. And therefore that could, like our value drift, from one particular state of happiness could drift into greater, more meaningful, flourishing states of happiness or utility based on what we discover and understand about this universe and neighboring universes, the multi-universe and life, the universe and everything, life, the multiverse and everything, or whatever. So yeah, I'm a bit worried about no value drift allowed. I'm a bit worried about goal preservation if we don't understand what the ultimate goals should be in the first place, if there is an ultimate goal.
Yeah, I guess goal preservation could include preservation of meta goals only. So, for example, if we had CEV, which, as I said, I don't think is likely, but it's a toy scenario to talk about, then CEV would be a goal and it would be preserved, but it would be a meta goal in the sense that it would allow us to change the object level goals and explore all these kinds of novelty, other scenarios, other forms of value that you're hinting at. And I think people in general have this meta goal of novelty and exploration and openness to experience and things like that. So I think and so that certainly could be what is preserved, that meta goal, and maybe you'd have some boundaries to prevent you from devolving into very bad things, what we currently regard as very bad outcomes or something. So I don't think it's I don't think culture preservation has to be boring in that sense. It could just be having this meta goal of exploration plus constraints against bad outcomes or something. It depends on how it's developed and what the values of the people are. So yeah, you could even have AIs who, as you say, go on axiological quests if they have the construction to want to do so. So I mean, humans are robots who have axiological quests and existential angst and things like that. So it's certainly possible to build agents in that way. Yeah, it's just that, and so really, I mean, it's even possible that an AI would value not restricting itself at all. But I think it's probably better, especially from the perspective of reducing suffering, to include some constraints, because if you have total drift, you could easily arrive at paperclip maximizing or totalitarianism or some other place you don't want to be, and that's not even valuable from that from your current perspective at all.
Yeah, so I see like philosophy as being interesting, and it's funny that like I used to be a bit skeptical of much of the philosophy that gets taught out there is about the history of philosophy, and I am to a degree, because why do people need to know about all history instead of actually focus on the philosophy, or the decision theory or the thinking tools that are actually relevant today, rather than being able to quote Plato or Aristotle or Pythagoras? So it's interesting, but it's interesting to see, how things have changed based on our understanding of, how the world works and how things haven't. So where am I going with this? I think so it's important, I believe, to have goals and to understand that goals are transitory, and the philosophies that we that we find useful at the time shouldn't be considered, at least most of the philosophy that I understand are mainstream today, shouldn't be considered the only philosophy that should ever be. So, like, for instance, we may be going through a transition right now, a civilizational transition, much like teenagers go through a growth spurt, which can be a little bit dangerous because they're rather reckless and like to do dangerous things. And I don't know what you were like as a teenager, but I certainly did some pretty dangerous things. And could have, not been around today to talk about it. And I'm glad that chance didn't decide for me to, accidentally get run over by a train, or get too drunk and stumble off a cliff or something like that. However, in the future, once we do have very wise, very intelligent, and very benevolent, hopefully, in AIs or some form of like a group mind, then maybe we're in more of a position to make more concrete decisions about long-term progress there. That's just a talking point.
Yeah, I don't have too much to say. Daniel Dennett has made a comment about the history of philosophy as being useful to see mistakes as well. There are a lot of mistakes that ordinary people have that past philosophers have also made, and it's helpful to think about them to overcome them.
So getting back to novelty then, the way in which novelty has been useful in the past, I guess it's been rather random. Like the natural selection is kind of like a random walk across nearest neighbor search space, and selected for by environmental conditions, which include other agents, I guess, mostly, as far as I understand. Now, in the future, we can actually, and what we do now is we model the environment, and we see other mountain probables on peaks in the landscape of value, and we try and optimize our path to those, and maybe even build bridges across ravines of negative stimuli or negativity in order to achieve, peaks of possibility. So I think, yeah, that it's interesting now that we actually try and map the territory, but we often get confused between the territory and map, and we have to realize that our maps aren't complete, and that we should always, try and update our maps based on new evidence. But about mining novelty, as you mentioned, unknown unknowns before, how do we find useful unknown novelty? We don't know where that would exist by definition. It's useful enough to rely on preferences to sort of make predictions about where novelty may be found in the future, and sort of aim in that direction, and maybe mine around the outskirts of these possible preferences in the future, and then discover more that way. But what about seeking missiles, useful novelty seeking missiles into complete unknown territory, and then try and mine outwards from there, if you know where I'm getting at.
Yeah, well, I guess people do that to some extent now, insofar as people try to seek areas of exploration that haven't been found before, and try to think outside the box. At least some people are driven in that way. So I guess there are different kinds of novelty. One is like intellectual novelty. Another could be just kind of novelty of structures in the world and novelty of experiences. So there are a lot of ways you could define it. It seems like the question would partly depend on your metrics. So if you had some more concrete definition of novelty, then you could use physics in theory. Like a sufficiently advanced agent could use physics to predict what regions of the universe would contain novelty, or what kinds of structures it could build that would have high values on this metric. So it's probably going to depend a lot on what in particular you're looking for as far as how you define novelty.
Well, that's a whole question. Our experience in the future may help us define what kinds of novelty count as useful. If we stumble upon novelty that we've never seen before, that has, we'd have to sort of compare, and in some case, in some way, sort of predict whether it would be compatible with what we understand as novelty, and sort of rank it based on that and other things, I guess. And so there's a metaphorically similar to the idea of other possible islands of stability in the periodic table. What we understand as stable elements today is based on what we can actually observe and test. But there has been theorized certain other islands of stable elements that we can, that possibly are out there, maybe in different universes or different configurations of maybe somewhere else in this universe. I don't know, but it may be possible to sort of predict these, but there may be islands of stability that we can't predict from where we are now, metaphorically. Have you heard of this idea of islands of stability in the table of elements?
No, I haven't.
Okay, right. Well, okay. Just so we know that there is a certain space of elements that are particularly stable that we can use, and as we graduate outwards, they become less stable and more transient. And then beyond that, you can't really observe anything because they're too transient. Based on our ability to, our technological ability to observe these sorts of things, that we can only make predictions about them. But based on the models that we've created on this particular possible the models that we've made of our periodical table elements, there may be islands of more stable elements elsewhere in the space of possible element configurations. So I'm just using that as a metaphor, really, as some way to help understand the idea that there may be islands of novelty that we have not yet discovered, but we can make predictions about. And there may be islands of novelty that we have not yet discovered that we can't make predictions about based on our current technological ability or our current sort of decision theory and current understanding of how the universe works or what counts as valuable. It gets, yeah. But this, I'm interviewing you.
One last thing I'll just mention is another part of novelty is also maybe predictability. So Jürgen Schmidhuber has the idea that it's not like if you look at a screen of random noise on a TV set or something, that's novelty, but it's not interesting. So novelty might also be things where Schmidhuber says that things that you can compress and like develop a predictive model of. So
yeah. So I mean, like any form of novelty other than complete noise that we understand, like you know, if we understand it, we can compress it. Understand it, like we you know, a television screen with white noise. I mean, it's unlikely to have much novelty there. But if we, you know, there might be some signal, some ancient alien race is sending us, and we just don't know how to like understand it. I don't really believe that, but you know, there could be novelty in these, in the fuzz and the noise out there that we're not at the stage to really understand yet. And so yeah, tag, compress, and you know, if it's too noisy, then delete. And so the idea, there, like, I think, do you think novelty should be considered as a core value to work towards? I mean, optimizing useful novelty as well as hedonism or negative or minimizing suffering.
Personally, relative to my own values, I don't care about novelty very much. I care about it a little bit insofar as other agents do, but I guess one area where it becomes relevant is when people think about, do you just count the pure numbers of agents, or do you also count the novelty or complexity of them? So some people say that very small agents, say if you looked at a bacterium or something, you might say, even if there are 10 to the 30th bacteria on the planet, we shouldn't count them 10 to the 30th times a single bacterium because there's so much similarity among them. And so I'm not sure if I agree with that or not. I think they should count a lot based on their numbers. And if you kind of imagine yourself as any given agent, it doesn't matter if you've got a twin, you still care about yourself just as much. But you can also make arguments like there's only a finite number of configurations of a given finite set of matter in the universe, and so everything repeats infinitely often, and maybe we care about the things that have higher, maybe things that are at least more rare should matter more. Although if everything occurs infinitely often, it's also unclear how to factor that in.
Right. So would you, it seems as though, based on our discussion before, as though you'd try and discount a future where experience is repeated. Like, for instance, if we, like, you've read David Pearce's writings, and he talks about a utilitronium shockwave, in which case the utility, if it's hedonism, for classical utilitarianism optimized for, it could mean that we just try and use nanotech, femtotech, attotech to optimize matter to scaffold a particular peak experience and repeat over time forever, and try and optimize as much of the universe as what's accessible to whatever light cones or wormholes we have access to. And we could end up just, with one quivering orgasmic universe without much flourishing in terms of new experience or novelty, but just, you know, having a peak experience. So that could be considered like a repugnant conclusion of a classical utilitarianism.
Given that I don't care that much intrinsically about novelty, it doesn't seem as bad to me. In fact, my main concern would be that any computations contain some degree of suffering. But I actually think if you got a utilitarian universe right, it would actually be not very bad relative to the other possibilities of how the universe could evolve. And if the structures are relatively simple, then maybe there wouldn't be a lot of what I call suffering subroutines in them. And so it could be a decent outcome. I guess another concern, though, would be like, it's hard to get it exactly right. And what if one person's happiness includes something that another person considers to entail suffering? And you'd have to make sure you were getting everything right. So
it's interesting.
For example, you can imagine an AI that wants to create lots of happy people, like what Bostrom mentions in Astronomical Waste, where you fill the universe with happy human lives. But suppose the AI has a slight misconfiguration of what it views as a human life, and so it simulates people with certain forms of brain damage, or it takes out their bodies, and so they go insane from not having somatic inputs, or there are various other ways you could imagine trying to achieve lots of happy human lives where something goes wrong, and then because the AI has already locked in its goals, it just continues. So we'd have to be very careful to avoid those kinds of outcomes.
Okay, well, what is the simplest form of life? Let's give it some bounds in terms of neural maths or complexity that are you concerned about now? And how do you predict that might change in the future?
Well, I'm a panpsychist in a functionalist sense, and so in principle I care about any subset of the universe, and I think the movement or particle interactions or just physical dynamics of any subset of the universe has at least non-zero traces of consciousness, of properties that we associate with consciousness. But in a practical sense, it's less clear exactly what scale I care about most. I guess my visceral emotions are drawn toward bigger animal-like creatures, like vertebrates or insects or agents that you can see with the naked eye and that have more complex interactions. But in principle, I also care about bacteria to some extent, as I mentioned, and given the numbers of them, they matter to a non-trivial degree, although I'm not sure how they compare with the aggregate of insects or mammals or something like that. And I've also written about the possibility that we would see suffering in fundamental physics. And so if you're a panpsychist, you do see suffering in fundamental physics to some degree. And given how much physics exists, both now and especially in the far future, even after stars burn out and it's not possible for an intelligent civilization to run computations, there will still be physics going on and maybe vacuum fluctuations. And so that could, in principle, occur infinitely into the future, or at least for a very long time. And so if you consider all of those physical interactions, that's a very large amount of total stuff that might have non-zero value. And so if you multiply the value per entity by the number of entities, it could be a very big number. So it's hard to motivate concern for that kind of thing, but it's also a difficult argument to totally ignore also. So I think we should just keep our minds open and think about the more obscure possibilities as well as the more close to home things that we care about.
I mean, like, people do seem to care more about the things which they can see. And there's certain large life forms which loom large in our sort of archetypal imagination of what counts as grand or has some sort of virtue. Lions, for instance, are considered a very virtuous species amongst many people, in terms of their general power and their ability to sort of get what they want and kill and things. But these lions, if if they were deciding the future of value in the universe based on where they are now, a male lion will eat other cubs that don't belong to its genetic line. It's quite gruesome. The way that they kill and prey is quite gruesome, but we love them. And they're the main character. They're the king of the jungle in much of the stories that our children read in popular culture, like The Lion King, for example. So I think for most people it's not obvious, really, except among just a very minute amount of philosophers who think about these sorts of things a little bit more than what the media feeds or whatever to most people, which is a shame. And it brings up the question, how do we get people, let's just say the question does come up as like some sort of point of discussion in politics. What sorts of arguments can you give, like somebody who's less philosophically or scientifically informed, that reducing suffering in insects, for example, is worth doing? In what way would you try and convince these people?
I guess there are different approaches you can take. I think a lot of people change their minds due to social influence rather than arguments per se. A lot of social movements are about ideas spreading to the point where they become mainstream, and then it becomes more socially approved to adopt that view. So having some people passionate about it would itself be a way to convince others. But as far as other approaches, I guess you can draw analogies between insects and people. I think a lot of compassion comes from thinking about how you are similar to another. And so we share a lot of basic brain components with insects. I mean, they're used to study neuroscience in some ways. We are both evolved organisms that respond to environmental stimuli and seek to achieve rewarding states and engage in reinforcement learning, and have something like sleep sometimes, and do a lot of other cognitive operations that are analogous. And many people today would be hung up on the question of whether insects are conscious. And many scientists tend to dismiss that idea, although there are many other scientists, especially in recent years, who take it seriously and or even think it's likely. And so that's sort of a consciousness, I think, is a shorthand that we use for describing these more complex underlying features of a mind. And maybe if people thought more in terms of degrees of consciousness rather than binary on-off consciousness, they would be able to extend sympathy to an insect without giving it the same amount of weight as they give a person. It seems like society is built around binary moral consideration, at least in a legal sense, where humans have full legal rights. Any non-human basically has no legal rights except maybe certain animal cruelty laws or special cases. So if there's a way to make a more graded extension of value or protection to organisms, then that could help as well. But in the short term, I think it's probably best to focus on open-minded people, philosophers, animal rights supporters, and other people who are ready for thinking about insects, because that's just a lower hanging fruit than trying to convince the general public, where given that many people don't even care that much about farm animals, it seems unlikely they would do much with arguments for insect suffering.
Interesting. So let's take another thought experiment. Imagine we encountered well, you encountered an alien civilization that had sort of discovered a value that was somewhat alien to your own, and you could see that they seemed to be flourishing and doing wonderful things. Now, would they be able to persuade you? First, okay, what would you argue in order to convince them that your philosophy or your ideas were worth taking up? And B, if they were to convince you, would they be doing it more likely through rational argument or through social manipulation? Oh,
So
let's say
yeah,
it more nicely. I guess, yeah, more social influence.
so I guess how I would try to persuade them would depend how their brains and psychology worked, because I think even in humans, discussion of morality is essentially about persuasion also. I mean, we attach some sort of extra significance to moral issues rather than, say, I like chocolate rather than vanilla statements. But at the end of the day, they're not in principle different. And talking about morality, or in the case of, say, divine command theory, saying that God instructs you to do something, those are ways to convince people to do something. And saying that there's a higher truth to my cause is just more persuasive than saying that I feel passionately about this and I hope you will too. So in so far as moral arguments are in some part just about trying to convince somebody, then by extension, if I were trying to convince aliens, I would just figure out what would be most convincing to them. So if they were very committed to their current cause, it might just have to be a matter of trade and saying, I'll help you get extra benefits if you give consideration to my concerns. That's a large part of why humans cooperate today, is the instrumental benefits of reciprocity. So that might be most of where it would come down to. But if they're also philosophical or interested in changing their minds and things, then I could also present the human perspective, or my human perspective. As far as what would convince me, I would guess it would be some mix of both. I mentioned already that I care to some extent about things that other agents value. Even if a paper clipper valued paper clips, I would care to some extent about that, just because it's an agent that cares about something. So it's sort of a golden rule stance, and thinking if I were in its place, I would care a lot about paper clips. So it seems a little bit harsh for me to totally disregard paper clips, even if I happen to care more about other things. So some of the same could go on with the aliens, and if I became friends with them, that they might be more persuasive. It's harder to feel totally opposed to something your friends care about. So I would guess a big portion of it would be social influence, and then also just pointing out that we care about this a lot, and emphasizing the golden rule intuition.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So you might elicit experts within the alien race to give their perspective on what it's like to be a paperclip maximizer. But still, I mean, if you're going to use the standard model of peer disagreement, I don't know if it's standard model, but what seems to be a standard model is just evaluating each expert's opinion as being just as relevant as the next. Then the best experts for an alien civilization's subjective well-being would be themselves. Now, I don't know if I phrased that right, or just best expert may not have anything to do with subjective well-being, just value in general. So if there was an alien race with paperclip maximizing being the ultimate goal, then how would you, I mean, just by using persuasion or comparing expert opinion, it just seems as though it would get very far. To me, I think it's going to come down to trying to learn what kinds of value have better mileage and better traction at the time you're discovering them. some sort of theory about what it is possible to count as useful value compared to like some dead end value or some less useful value.
Well, but useful for what?
That,
for evolutionary survival, or?
No. Just I mean, like as a civilization moving forward. And now you mentioned before that you were a panpsychist, and so if you believe that there's some form of properties in the universe that that contribute to what we call consciousness, and you think that there is intrinsic value in these properties, then at the very least, you admit to allowing the universe or some form of empirical understanding of the universe to inform what counts as useful or valuable, right?
Yeah, that
even
would
though
be the case
you
for
don't
any
claim
value
to
system.
be. Yep. Okay. So therefore, you'd agree that having a greater understanding and a greater perspective on how the universe worked, including, these micro experiences or configure or like points in the universe that contribute to the experience of value, then yeah, it seems as though a moral realist and a moral anti-realist that shares, or at least intersects, a lot of value there in the empirical side of understanding what's valuable.
Yeah, a lot of
And having that
instrumental value.
inform. Yeah, right. Yes, so like who was it, Hume, who said you cannot get oughts from is's, but I guess maybe that's the case. But I think what most people take is you shouldn't let the real world inform whatsoever what should be. I think it's going a little bit too far.
Yeah, I mean, I think almost any value function will be defined relative to an ontology. Like even say a simple reinforcement learning agent will perceive states and have a value function that maps from states to rewards. And so if you have the meta value of improving your ontology, then you will tend to value learning more. Yeah, just another point about the pan. I was just going to make a minor point about the panpsychism. I'm not a panpsychist in the Chalmers sense of thinking, or in the pan-protopsychist sense of thinking there are little constituents that combine to give rise to bigger experiences, but rather I think there's just physics, but physics has properties that we call conscious to various degrees.
On the topic of like suffering and what counts as suffering, you've written recently, I mean, like I think we'll get into insects later, but reinforcement mechanisms as having some form of degree of suffering involved. So if the reinforcement mechanism is complex enough, I don't know what your argument is there, but does it mean that you think that there's some endemic form of suffering in that, or do you think it is even more fundamental than reinforcement learning? Any form of computation whatsoever without reinforcement entails suffering.
Yeah, the latter view. Insofar as I think everything has non-zero consciousness, I also think everything has non-zero suffering, just because suffering, like consciousness, is a very broad term with lots of ideas baked into it, and those ideas apply to greater or lesser degree to anything. But the bigger question is how much suffering you want to consider to be in a given system. And for most systems, the degree of suffering would be extremely small. As far as reinforcement learning, I would consider that to be one example of many kinds of cognitive operations that go into our general conception of consciousness or reward and punishment or motivation and these various other high-level concepts. So a reinforcement agent has important similarities to animal-like brains in how it behaves and how it processes stimuli and things like that. But I think even non-reinforcement agents can also matter because they can do other things. Like they can still escape from danger. They can still value situations as being good or bad, even if they don't learn from them. So there are lots of components to what is hedonic experience or what is preference, achievement, or being an agent with goals. And so these kinds of things apply to any physical system to a non-zero degree.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're not an absolutist, either one way or the other. It's interesting. Okay, now, well, okay, so in terms of what would a universe look like, do you believe, from your point of view right now, as one that had achieved the goals that you're advocating today?
Well, there are a lot of possibilities. So insofar as I'm a panpsychist, there's no perfect universe. There's no suffering-free universe, except an empty universe, but that's probably not possible. But then, given more realistic constraints, there are various possibilities that could be better or worse. And so, within the constraints of realism that also respect the values of others, probably a reasonably good outcome would be something like CEV, where humans retain most of the control over the shape of the future up to the point of a goal-preserving AI, and then they're able to engage in more reflection and achievement of things that they care about, as long as there's sufficient attention paid to preventing suffering. So, for example, I would not want a libertarian future in which every person gets his own solar system and can run whatever computations he wants, because some people will inevitably run very bad computations. And so there would need to be strong constraints on what people could do, and similarly constraints on the simulations that are run for scientific purposes, in a similar way as we have regulations on treatment of lab animals. And there should also be thought paid to what sorts of robots or other potentially somewhat conscious agents are created as part of the society. We don't want the robots or the subroutines of the society to suffer too much either. So I think there's a lot of scope for adjusting how much or how little suffering a given post-human civilization contains. And so a good outcome could be one that achieves most of the value that people like LDS or Yudkowsky or yourself or other people who want to achieve complexity and novelty and happiness are looking for, but then also most of that can be done without extremely severe forms of suffering, without very bad lab experiments, without like letting people run sadism simulations or whatever. So making sure we have a humane future that's stable and respects suffering constraints would be a good outcome. So already we see some movement toward that. There's a lot of discussion about Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which argues that historically we have moved somewhat in a better direction, where society has more flourishing and less violence than in the past. And in general, these kinds of constraints that we impose on individual behavior can often be good at achieving more humane outcomes.
Yeah, the interesting book, and it seems to be like a bit of an expansion upon Peter Singer's expanding circle of ethical consideration idea. Yeah, it's good to see, that a lot of serious thought leaders, I don't know, for want of a better word, are really taking this idea on. Yeah, great. Yeah, interesting. Now, yeah, I've gotten a lot of questions. Some of these questions I've asked you are kind of similar to questions that people ask me to ask you. So, yeah, like Mike Johnson and Timo and David Pearce and Andreas and all that have, like, David X. Limer have been very, very kind and contributing all sorts of questions here. Haven't had the chance to go through them all. But we've covered a lot on AI and value. Now, so Here's one from Timo. I was going to ask it earlier, but what counterintuitive, it sort of ties into something that we were talking about before, revolving around how you persuade the general public about what counts as value. But is some concrete examples of counterintuitive philosophical or scientific insights that you think might be valuable for the general public to hear and to understand?
Yeah, so I guess there are a lot of broad thoughts on this, and in general, probably scientific literacy and philosophical literacy are the best long-term approaches in this regard, because there are a lot of worldview changes that you slowly absorb by learning more. But I think what we touched on with consciousness would be one important example of that. It's common, and even in the past I may have thought to some extent of consciousness as the special thing that's either present or not. And especially if from a religious perspective or related ideas, you might have this view of humans as somehow different from other things, or at least life as different from other things. It seems like life is somehow endowed with a spirit, or secular people may not use the word, but they may still have a similar conception that there's something special about life relative to inanimate matter or other parts of physics. So thinking more about, first of all, the philosophical arguments against that kind of dualism, and then also just absorbing more the physicalist picture in a scientific sense can help one understand how, like, even the human body is lots of little mechanisms, each one that looks very simple. So even in neurons, or something like a single neuron firing is a relatively simple process from a high-level description, or single circuits in a brain can look like just a few neurons going around, and from a high level it just looks dumb and not very exciting. And the same thing happens throughout the body or throughout other animals. So the important thing is, when you put a lot of dumb stuff together, it can look different at a high level. And there's discussion of emergence as a concept, and I dispute the idea of strong emergence, that there's actually something fundamentally different when you've got a lot of complex pieces. But the basic idea that things just look very different when you've got a lot of stuff going on at once is a relevant point, and we see that in other domains like economies or ecosystems as well. So I think it just seems as though humans are different in some fundamental way because they're just very complicated. I mean, psychology is in some sense much harder than physics, because psychology is dealing with extremely unpredictable and enormous systems with 85 billion neurons in a single brain. Like, there's no way you can keep track of that with present day computing power, or with only one other brain of the same complexity. So we mistake complexity for being something special, when it's really just a lot more of the little dumb stuff. So when you internalize that idea, it becomes more intuitive that there's no clear separation among even life and non-life or different parts of physics. It's one big collection of stuff, and some of it looks different or is more complicated than other parts. So that gives one a sense of humility and can extend compassion more broadly. And in general, I think this mechanistic view of the universe can be very helpful. I often try to dissolve philosophical problems by imagining the universe as a big video game. And if you imagine programming a video game, think about how that would work, and that can usually give you a good answer to the problem of free will, or the problem of like the passage of time, or other problems that seem difficult when you're actually embedded in the universe. If you think about programming an agent in a video game that to do it, then the problems become much less confusing.
Interesting. So let's talk about emergentism now. there are some out there who just don't like the term emergentism or emergence because they think it just it's a license to explain away, understanding what's really going on, and so it's kind of like invoking pixie dust in order to, like, as a plot device in the science fiction novel, for in lieu of something that can't be explained, right, or that shouldn't be explained. So, according to the view of whoever is invoking this view. So, look, now, so you mentioned strong emergentism. Now, to you, does that equate to some form of dualism, like a substance dualism there? Or how do you define the difference between weak and strong emergentism?
I'm not sure if it's substance or property dualism or something else, but I think the basic idea is that there's some ontological difference between the whole and its parts, so that the whole is not just a lot of parts interacting, but there's some extra ontological thing that happens. So yeah, I mean, I don't see any reason to hold that view, and it seems to be just a mistaking complexity and the inability of your brain to keep track of everything for thinking that there actually is something extra.
And our sort of need to categorize things and give things, like, impose our ontology on reality in order for us to be able to compute things and pigeonhole everything so that it makes sense to us. There was a study done recently on children, and they pick up this sort of motivation to imply essentialism, essential ontologies to reality very early, and I think it's useful for us in the sense that it helps us, come to grips with the sheer complexity out there. But yes, I think it's a very wise position to take, to assume that just because we have our private ontologies doesn't mean that that's how the universe actually really works. It just aids in our ability to make sense of it. Yeah. So what is weak emergence to you then? Is it just the agreement that there seems to be properties that happen at a higher level than just the individual, the reduced atoms or whatever? Yeah. Do you think, like, there is useful there's useful definitions for defining the appearances of seemingly new and interesting phenomena that don't seem to be observable or understandable by just looking at the individual elements of the whole?
Well, it's always going to be a fuzzy issue. Like, there's no clear boundary where a new phenomenon emerges. I guess one way to look at it would be to say, can you use a different model at a higher level than try to use lots of lower level models? So, like, if you're thinking about the spread of a rumor in a population or something, at a low level you could talk about individual neurons in people's brains creating patterns of air movements going to other people's ears, and a lot of low level stuff that's very complicated. But you could also at a high level use, say, a logistic growth model where the rumor starts out small, more and more people hear it, and then eventually everybody's heard it or something. So, like, the ability to apply a single simple model at a higher level, like a single logistic function, to brush under the rug all the extra stuff could be seen as one kind of example of how to consider emergence, because it's just a new level at which a different kind of abstraction can get you something. And so that would be different than, like, the white noise example, where there's probably not a clear way to describe the white noise other than to describe every little pixel. There's not like a more simple overarching narrative of how it works.
What are your thoughts about the idea of, you've heard of the extropians in, like, the late 80s, early 90s, and even today there's still extropian forums going on, being like one of the crowds where the idea of transhumanism seemed to have propped up from, and a lot of the interesting futurological ideas. The idea of what do you think of extropy as being an interesting motivating model for progress?
Well, it's not something I focused on a lot. I guess it's one of a number of kind of motivating visions that people have. So, I mean, I guess I would see it as similar to fun theory, or maybe some of the things that you've talked about as far as kind of a set of general things that are motivating that different people want to push the future towards.
Okay. All right. I'm thinking maybe it's a good time to sort of start winding up. So you're okay at least in this point in time, with a continuous repetition of peak experience. But I guess what I'd like to discuss is how much you think novelty or complexity should be involved in this peak experience, or whether novelty and complexity is just a means to an end to achieving peak experience, and once we get there we don't need it anymore and can sort of get rid of it, or whether there's some form of like a level of novelty and complexity that's required for a peak experience. I'm just interested in refining what you think about that.
Well, I guess there are two different issues. One is whether it matters. So let's consider first the case of a single peak experience. I think many people have the intuition that the brain having the peak experience should be relatively complex in order for it to matter to a non-trivial degree. Like an extremely simple system, I mean, consider a reinforcement agent that just gets the maximum possible reward at every time step, and it's like a few lines of code long. Most people wouldn't consider that to be very important. And
like
so a human type brain, a human type brain requires 85 billion or whatever neurons, and so if you wanted some peak experience by a human brain, you'd already need an extraordinary amount of computing power. In present day terms, you need like a building size computer or something to create that. So the amount of complexity in a given peak experience could be very high. But then there's also the issue of across peak experiences, whether you want variation. And I guess my intuition why it's not that important to have variation across experiences would be that relative to the agent itself, it feels the same way whether it has 1 or a billion copies. And from the inside, you don't care how many others of you there are, or whether the others have differences necessarily, unless you're contemplating that specific issue. So like novelty is a drive that we as outsiders have, but it's not something that the agents themselves necessarily care about unless they're programmed to. And it's certainly possible to program robots that don't care about novelty.
Right, it's interesting because from an agent's perspective, their existence seems fundamental to it experiencing. Now, I don't know if they're like you mentioned before that you're a panpsychist and you believe that there could be experience outside of agents. So it's hard to imagine sort of optimizing the universe for non-agents. And I can, but I guess philosophically, I can imagine a universe that doesn't have any agenthood whatsoever. That could, be just one peak experience, just pure experience or something like that. If you're a panpsychist, if you take that view.
Yeah, I suppose that would be like the case of a very simple mind. I think in order to have a complex mind, you'd need some degree of agency, although you could probably strip down the kind of agency that humans have. Like you could take out decision making or take out language, take out various other functions that the brain does and focus more on the hedonic parts. But I think our assessment of conscious experience, remember, it's always in our heads what we consider to be happiness and how much there is. So like our assessments of experience will tend to vary along with the complexity of the mind. And if you only stripped out everything but the hedonic hotspots of the human brain, I think most people wouldn't consider that to be very important, or at least not nearly as important as the full brain, because the context and the richness of the other parts make it matter more.
But still, popular opinion is really just informed by, intuition to a large extent. And how much should we allow our intuitions to really inform what counts as valuable? A lot of our intuitions don't really accurately. We believe even today that a lot of our intuitions don't actually count. That don't predict valued states. Even preferences don't accurately predict valued states, very accurately at least. Actually experiencing happiness and having a preference to experience aren't the same things. And there's been papers out there written on the difference between our preferences and actually what we end up liking or what we end up enjoying. So yeah, where was I going with that? So yeah, the idea that we just don't know. I think there's plenty of fertile ground for research and understanding into what counts as valuable. I keep on coming back to that. No, I'm hoping that it becomes a very a field that we spend a lot of energy and resources into trying to explain. Either that or trying to optimize some agent to do it for us that takes us. The thing is, like, okay, let's just say we did build like an ethical AI that's very good at mining what counts as value and getting a better understanding of the landscape of possible value out there and what would be peak value. Should we be concerned if it suddenly decided, well, human value isn't that useful? Let's get rid of the humans and optimize the atoms of humans into configurations that can experience more and more value, even greater than any human value could predict.
Well, I guess it depends on your standpoint. That could be a signal that the machine has malfunctioned relative to what you were intending. Like, insofar as people now place high value on something like humanity existing.
Well, the conditional there was that we asked the AI to do the most ethical thing.
Well, but that requires that we programmed it correctly and also, set the initial conditions for the extrapolation process.
Human, right? Yeah. So I think you're assuming that that there's no real value in the universe, and that the relative value that humans have is the value that we're asking it to optimize. But if we just asked it a more meta question of out of all the landscapes of values outside of the human condition, but also including the human condition, could incorporate which value is the best and optimize that, it may not be human value. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I don't think there's a well-defined answer to the meta question. It's always going to depend what meta notion of value the AI has.
Yeah. So you think the AI's meta values cannot be informed by empirical observation of how the universe works?
Well, they will be informed, but they're not. It's not sufficient to know about the empirical situation. As you said, does not give rise to ought. So, in general, a value.
Well, as far as we know.
Yeah, well, but it's even. I don't know what it would look like for an is to be an ought. I mean, maybe it's a defect in my ability and the ability of other people to think about the issue, but it seems like a relatively unlikely outcome that we would be so defective at understanding that. And then the other issue is, even if there were some answer to that question, it's not clear why we should care about it. That's related to the question you just asked, I guess. Like, even if there was some moral truth and the AI could understand it, would you agree with following that, or would you want to keep humans around? Because it does seem very unlikely that if there were some unique thing that the AI would be trying to track, it would involve humans in more than trivial ways.
Well, I mean, I mean, I guess we could also say, well, whatever value space is optimal in the universe. We could say take humans along for the ride, regardless of whether they end up as humans at the end or not. The whole like post-humanism argument that maybe we should not be sort of wedded to what it means to be human in physical, in our, the structure of our body, but perhaps also the design of our mind. And if the design of our mind significantly changes, if like we decide to upgrade it in ways that give it far more memory than what we have, and we have like a few spots of memory that we sort of chunk together bits of information and then process them in short-term memory. So let's just say we had huge amounts of memory, and let's just say we had a larger cognitive, like a lot more horsepower, but also be able to tap cognitive silos of different like experiential possibilities, so that we could experience wider varieties of Nozick's experience machines, and for instance, as a motivator to actually do change the way we process or think, or the way that we are conscious. It could be very interesting, and the optimization of human values, or what we understand as valuable today, may be strongly tethered to our sort of biological biases, but that may not be the best way to, so like surely like a continuum between our values today and at some point in the landscape of possible value could be achieved, I imagine, with enough wisdom and intelligence.
You mean like
continuity? So we may not
yeah.
Look, I'm not sure that the continuity argument is watertight there either, but like it's so like for instance, I consider myself Adam now, even though I'm a lot older than when I was a child, but the child Adam is very different than the adult Adam, but I can still consider them me intuitively. But if you take the opposite line, I'm different every second. David Pearce, for instance, believes that experience is bound up in wave states. So when there's some sort of decoherence, the actual experience is contained within like a coherent quantum wave, and then it's only information which doesn't contain like the necessary primitives of experience that's spread out and then reuptake by a next okay, so there's an oscillation between coherence and decoherence. When there's a decoherence, all like experience is lost, but the information about the experience is retained and then reuptaken at the next coherence. I'm pretty sure I'm sort of taking an axe to his theory there, but I'm certainly not a physicist. So what do you think about that theory, by the way?
Well, so my general problem with most theories of consciousness, or well, at least one problem, is that they don't necessarily explain why we think we're conscious. So take property dualism as another example. Eliezer Yudkowsky has made the same point, that and even Chalmers recognizes it. So David Chalmers would say there's a physical process that does the operations of seeing red, say, like red light hits the eyes and it gets processed in the visual cortex, and all the usual physicalist explanations. But then you would say there's also an extra property of consciousness that is additional to the mechanical stuff. But then it's not explained why we believe we have that extra property, because it's epiphenomenal, and so it can't like cause our physical bodies to think that it exists. And so a similar point applies with quantum explanations of consciousness. I'm not sure if it applies to David Pearce's in particular, but especially like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff's views.
Okay, so yeah,
and the same applies to even like Russellian monism, the view that consciousness is intrinsic to the nature of physics or something, they all fail to explain why we believe we're conscious. Because what's the mechanism from this thing being conscious to our verbal centers outputting the sentence that we are conscious? So my view would be that there is no actual ontological thing called consciousness, but there's only the outputting of the verbal statements that we are conscious, and other related mental thoughts and processes that correspond to the belief that we're conscious.
Well, so let's backtrack. Do you think there's anything ontological in the universe? Do you think there is, like, anything different, or do you think there's just one thing? Like, are you a monist?
Yeah, that seems simplest from an Occam's razor perspective. And like, if there were something else in the universe, it would seem correct to call that physics, and so you'd end up with physicalism anyway. But yeah, I mean, so I do believe that there exists physics, and I'm not exactly sure what it means for something to exist, but I do have this idea that there is something out there that is physics, and it does various things that physics does. And that's the only thing that I would believe exists, given my current, because I don't see anything that can't be explained outside of that.
Okay, so you believe that there's physics, but you're not willing to really break down physics into smaller subsets of it. You think that there's just basic material and energy, or just energy?
Well, I mean, it's subject to whatever physicists come up with. I mean, it could be vibrating strings or brains or whatever. Like, there might be some fundamental building block, or maybe we're thinking about it entirely wrong. There's not actually a thing. It's just math somehow existing. I don't exactly know what it means for math to exist, but like, I don't have specific commitments on the exact fundamental nature of it, but it could be some fundamental mathematical structures or something, and then everything else would be built from that. Right. But I don't have solid views on this, because I'm confused about what it means for physics to exist, and what physics could even be.
It's interesting. David Pearce has sort of thought about using some physics that exists on the skin of a black hole in order to increase the time of a coherent wave state, so that the same conscious or experiencing agent would be able to maintain its experience without giving up and basically dying every billionth of a second, like based on how many wave state collapses there are every moment or whatnot. So yeah, it's interesting. So back to the continuum idea, the idea that, like, do we need a continuum to get from our human space of value to a possibly more optimal and able to achieve greater, like a pattern space of value that could achieve that was compatible with achieving greater value spaces in the future. So getting from here to there, we just intuitively assume that there should be some form of continuum, but if we're just dying and being new versions of us are being recreated every sort of atto Google second or whatever, then yeah, it seems to like dissolve any valuable idea of what counts as useful over time, to me.
Or at least it challenges the idea of continuity, and like even within our brains as we evolve, it's some factions of our brains are dying and being taken over by others. Like when we adopt a new perspective, or if we adopt a new ethical system or something, new impulses in our brains take over the old ones and suppress the old neural connections. And so it's like with nature or something, that's a battle of survival in the brain. And like with history, the winners always declare history as marching forward in progress. So like if you suddenly became a paperclip maximizer, your brain would probably say, I can't believe how mistaken I was all that past time. Now I finally see that I've made progress toward the more correct view. So whoever wins writes history and says that they are the better endpoint of this process.
So what does that say about what sort of future we should be working towards?
Well, it always depends on your current perspective, but I value suffering a lot, and so I want to reduce it. There's not something more fundamental, but it's just a very strong motivation that I have, and that's what I want to put my life to work towards. So.
I mean, what motivates that? Is it just your current, like, is it philosophical? Oh, what really motivates you to disvalue suffering? What's the source of this motivation? I mean, we spoke about it briefly before, but why do you think it's like an intrinsic ontological property of the universe that should be disvalued, and bliss or hedonism another? Or you think, yeah?
No, I think
actually,
it's
probably a bad question. It's not actually what I was meaning to ask. Yeah. So the idea, you've already answered that question. So the idea that how do you categorize the right mixture, or how would you value the right mixture of suffering and hedonism? Is there any sort of ideal state there? Is it just minimizing suffering and maximizing happiness? Is that what you're working towards?
Well, with the focus on minimizing suffering, so purely from my own perspective, I don't care too much about happiness, but when I factor in the values of others, I give it some weight. I guess we have many experiences that, from at least our high-level assessment, are suffering-free and pleasant, and so those would be relatively good states. And then if people sufficiently value diversity as well, you might want to have a diversity of those. But nothing will be perfect, and even within our brains, there are potentially suffering components of them. This is especially so if you take the panpsychist view. So there's no perfect outcome, but especially if you care the most about these high-level systems like animal brains, then you can do a lot better by eliminating the very worst states.
Well, yeah. So do you see us solving the question, how do you think the best way to solve the underlying issue of how to reduce suffering the best? Is it something that we're going to do as people, or do we need to design an AI to do that, or is there some combination there? And if we're going to be either designing AIs or getting humans to do it, or a combination somewhat, what level of understanding of how functional properties, how the universe works, how biology works, how quantum physics works, and the substrates of valence works, how is that going to inform development of the right types of thinking in order to answer these big questions, or the right types of AI in order to solve the big problems?
Yeah, so it's going to be a combination of humans and AIs in the long term, and that's partly just because unless society collapses or something, AIs will come around, and the same is true for biological and physics, progress in biology, physics, and neuroscience. All these things will come on their own, assuming civilization proceeds in a similar way as we've seen so far. So I think suffering reducers can basically take what society produces and use that to inform their intuitions about what matters, as well as their strategies. So for that reason, I think I don't think it's optimal from a suffering reduction perspective to advance like fundamental biology or something necessarily, because that will probably happen, be done by other people. But what's more important is to take the insights that are already there and analyze how they what they imply for reducing suffering, and use them to inform your view. So I personally tend to take more of a generalist approach to issues, and trying to learn a lot about a little bit about a lot of topics, because there's so much out there and so little has been done so far to translate it into action guiding policies for reducing suffering. But yeah, I mean, in general, it'll be some humans, and then humans trying to influence the trajectory of AI, and people, as the movement gets bigger to reduce suffering, people can specialize more into different areas of focus. And it'll be a lot like any other movement that makes progress, or like a biological scientific discipline, or any other group of people who are working on a problem. You do some mix of building the movement, some mix of big picture goal setting, some mix of smaller scale research on a particular domain.
So yeah, I guess there's a, should we, there's the issue of how much of what we understand today about reducing suffering should we focus on, how much energy we should focus on using what we understand today to reduce suffering now, and how much energy we should be using to help further understand how to do this in the future, and implementing future technological advances, increasing understanding of what counts as suffering, and all sorts of things. So, is it going to be another mixture there, like that you're speaking about, approaches to reducing suffering? Okay, focus, reduce suffering today, but also focus some resources on reducing suffering tomorrow and into the long-term future. And how do you think you should balance up the units of effort between these two ideas, these two approaches?
Yeah, I agree. It's a tough issue. It seems like most people focus on reducing suffering in the short term, and there are good reasons for that, in that the short term is more predictable and you have better feedback, and but it does also seem very important to think about big picture questions, because you need to make sure you're going in the right direction, and a lot of issues can flip around the more as you learn more. So for example, somebody who just was concerned with human welfare might favor giving animals to people in the third world to help them come out of poverty. But then if you consider animal welfare, maybe you'd be concerned about that. And then if you add in wild animals, then maybe it changes your assessment again if the animals reduce wild animal suffering by insects in the area, or so there are a lot of possibilities of how you would evaluate a situation as you learn more. And so Nick Bostrom calls these points of learning more crucial considerations, basically issues that if they came out a certain way could change your assessment of whether an action is even good or bad in the first place. And it happens a lot that if you're really taking a broad view and trying to evaluate the consequences of something, you can flip back and forth between thinking a single policy is good or bad, depending on how much you've learned or what probabilities you assign to various scenarios. So that suggests that it's at least important to have some portion of people working on big picture issues, which are not necessarily just the far future, but also bigger philosophical questions, and like just challenging conventional wisdom about reducing suffering. So it's difficult to, and then also the far future may matter a lot, because it could be very big. And so even a tiny change in the trajectory of how we get there could matter for trillions of minds. Although it's also, there are also reasons to be more modest about the trade-offs between short-term versus far future work, because, for example, there are anthropic arguments that maybe the far future won't exist because of scenarios like the doomsday argument, or even the simulation argument, or other ways in which maybe the future is less big than we think it is, for various reasons. Like Copernican mediocrity says that it would be extremely unrare that we would be the few billion humans who are in a position to radically influence the rest of the light cone. So maybe it's true, but it at least seems kind of strange. So I think it's good to maintain modesty and not assume that the far future obviously dominates automatically just because it could be so big.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Oh well. Yeah. Is there any other points that you want to discuss in relationship to AI and discovering value and what counts as value in this discussion? Because I think it might be useful to discuss some of the other things. Yeah, some of your other points of interest in another discussion. Because this one, I don't know how long we've been going for, but I imagine it's over an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah. So yeah, is there any other points that you think is a logical continuation of what we've been talked about, have been asked so far?
Not anything big. I'll just mention that as we started out the discussion talking about FRI has as a priority to research AI trajectories, like what AI might look like, different scenarios for, will it be like a concentrated agent, or will it be a very distributed kind of economic-like process, or and who will control it, and what forces will shape the direction, and will it have goal preservation? Lots of basic issues about the structure and nature of AI, and then also questions about which of those scenarios will involve more or less suffering, and would a human-controlled AI, or a paper-clipping AI, or another kind of AI that we don't have good names for yet, what kinds of suffering would they result in, and which ones should we push more for and less for? So we're always interested in getting more people to think about these topics and maybe write an essay for our website, or otherwise contribute ideas.
Absolutely. Sounds fantastic what you're doing. And thank you so much for joining us in this discussion, and looking forward to more in the future. So yeah,
Thanks.
This has been Brian Tomasik, and yeah, so check out his website at reducing-suffering.org, I think it is, and there's a number of others too. So,
thanks for having me.
And I'll just stop the broadcast here, and thanks also for all our viewers.